I mean, I don't think it's like a luxury. I think this is actually necessary, because if we want to change anything in the world, we're going to have to get birth right first and foremost. So all these other issues that seem to be plaguing us in the media and everything, I don't think that we're going to touch those, because we have a faulty foundation as to how babies are even coming into the world.
Today's Into Healing guest is Dr. Nathan Riley, a holistic gynecologist and home birth doctor who advocates for women to give birth on their own terms with informed consent, personal agency, and following the natural rhythms of nature as a guide. This is Into Healing, and I'm your host, Mira Kaddoura. If you enjoy this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter, intohealing.com/newsletter, for one book recommendation, one quote, and one daily practice delivered straight to your inbox. Nathan, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
I remember going to the screening of The Business of Birth Control, and then there was a panel after that, and you were on that panel. I remember it was you and Queen Afua and a few other people.
Yeah.
And I remember how moved I was by that panel, because I'd never really, as a person who had had 3 kids at that point, I'd never really seen anybody talk with such conviction about the agency women deserve in the Western medical system, especially women's health care.
Yeah.
And it stuck with me, and I was like, we need to talk at some point, so I'm just so grateful that you're here and you could share your wisdom and your thoughts with us.
Thank you. Wisdom, that's a charged term. There's a lot of pressure there. It's always an honor to be seen in a very kind of foreign space. I was the only male on the stage. I think when I was a little kid, I never thought I'd be out there advocating around birth control or around reproductive rights or justice or even taking care of women and being in that privileged role. But I found myself there, and my story has taken some wild turns, of course. But to have been recognized by a total stranger for in a space where actually I think being quite vulnerable, I think is one of the biggest testaments to maybe the importance of the work without even knowing it, at the time. So thank you for reaching out and connecting with me after that event.
Yeah, you're welcome. So what brought you to women's healthcare? How did you end up there? Can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, the way that the Western medical education, the program works, is you go to college just like everybody, but you don't really learn any skills. You're really doing all of this work in order to get to more education. And if you're lucky enough to get more education and you do really well there, you're rewarded with more education. And it just keeps layering itself on top of, these layers that our society seems to value of accolades and credentials. And then at the end, you're supposed to have a specialty. But I didn't really find myself in a specialty early on with a specialty that really made sense. I came from a life of reading food labels and exercise. I used to be an Ironman distance triathlete and a rock climber, and I really thought, man, I feel really healthy. I feel like if other people could feel this good, that would be a really, maybe our world would be better if people knew how to eat, and the education piece and all of that. But when I got into medical school, I didn't find that I had enough time with people. I was really being trained in pharmaceuticals for the most part. You don't even learn surgery until you're in residency, but through that, it was like, gosh, it kind of seems boring to just be doing pills all day for diabetes and, weight loss and blood pressure and whatnot. Maybe I'll just be a surgeon, or maybe I'll do something else. But then obstetrics and gynecology, which was my last rotation in medical school, you have to rotate through all the major specialties before you pick one. I got to see a baby being born. And as somebody who has been incentivized to answer the right multiple choice question over and over and over, there was never going to be an answer for this one. It was like the ultimate essay where there's no right answer. It's like Waldorf school. You're just playing, kind of, and trying to pontificate as to what could or should be, maybe. For me, it was like the ultimate Gordian knot, and I could maybe be curious enough to just try to unpack this for the rest of my life. And then, of course, once you get into residency, which is actually sort of the coveted thing, as a person who likes the sciences, to get into a medical residency is a pretty big honor. But that was not a place where I could be curious and ask questions. In fact, I was actually sort of punished for asking so many questions. And
Why is that?
I think people don't realize that through our medical education, we're really being trained to be technicians for a variety of different corporate interests. And I'm not here in conversation with you to bash the medical system, because there's a really good reason to have emergency rooms, operating rooms, pharmacies, blood banks on site. The acute care, the emergent care that Western medicine provides is really, really great. But I found myself sort of like, okay, so we just have to understand how these pharmaceuticals work and where the receptors are and how the physiology works, and that's it? Like, that's all that I invested about $500,000 to do? Like, that's pretty easy. You can look that stuff up in books. To ask the further questions and to build on that is not necessarily incentivized. And so I found myself maybe very distracted by the bigger questions of, okay, so I'm going to go into obstetrics and gynecology. Where do babies come from? It sounds like an easy question. It sounds like something we talk to about our 5 and 7-year-olds. But there's not really a great answer for that. If it's just a matter of egg and sperm meeting, well, that sounds still very mechanical. And the other, I think, aspect of becoming a sort of a technician is that you are really only supported in trying to unravel the mechanical, measurable things about life. But if you look at like a rock and a plant, there's something different. And I was really interested in that. Or if you look at a plant in your Labrador, or your Labrador in a human, there's something intrinsically different about these different categories. But what is it? Well, Western medicine didn't give me that answer. So I wanted to go further and further and further. And I wanted to I was more compelled to understand what was the experience you had growing twins and giving birth to your children. And when you ask a woman about what was their birth like, they're not telling me the measurable things that I studied for so many years. They're telling me, oh, it was
How they
exciting,
felt.
it was joyful, it was, I'm so sad about what happened, or I was so scared. And that's not something that's easily found in the peer-reviewed literature. I like to connect and to really appreciate, who are you? Where do you want to go? Because until I know where you're going and where you came from, I can't be present with you. So I have to get those out of the way. And we can sit and now do this thing, and I can help put all of my resources around you to support you, going wherever you want to go. And this is not just true for birth. This is also true for virtually everything.
Yeah, everything.
Even death, which is my other specialty. So that was a roundabout way of saying, I've got a drum and it seems like only I can hear it. Maybe you can pick up on little whispers of it. But
So you found yourself medical school, then you started practicing as a practicing OB.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
Well, the story that I really like to share is in my residency training program, which is 4 very hard years of about 100 hours of work per week. You're not sleeping very much and you're desperately tired. And in my program, you get to work with midwives in the hospital, which are different from midwives who work outside of the hospital, but it was still not a surgical practice.
That's amazing, though, that those were there.
Yeah. I mean, we just got exposed to that. And most pregnancies are low risk. So we got to see a lot of what midwives might do in the hospital. And as you're getting more tired and you're learning how to do more things with surgery and pharmaceuticals, I started really wondering, like, is it really helpful that I'm doing all these things? And it turns out that as I peeled back all these interventions, the outcomes were improving. Less C-sections. Birthing families were feeling safer. They were feeling more appreciated, more seen. They were feeling like they were the center again, as opposed to me implementing something on their behalf. It was really more about, hey, what do you need? And if you don't need me to do something, I'm going to stay out of the way. And when we take that approach, we actually see that birth is not as complicated as the media or whoever makes it seem. But the other thing was that in the clinic, again, I'm a technician for the pharmaceutical company. You brought up the business of birth control. It's like, man, I've got an entire book here that I carry in my pocket about hormonal contraception. And when you look at it, none of them actually even contain hormones. It's synthetic versions of chemicals that look in the body in some ways like hormones. But I started asking those questions. And again, there it is, just always ever more curious. Could there be some downside to using synthetic chemicals in a 14-year-old's body? for 10 years. And it turns out that there are. But that's not really what I'm being trained to do. I'm being trained to get people's problems solved as quickly as possible, which is actually a consumer-driven problem of people demanding that we have a quick fix for everything. That's a part of the issue. So as I started expanding on that, it was like, gosh, I'm not sure I really like what I'm doing. Because it didn't seem like I, one, had a lot of agency to be creative. I'm left-handed, which there are not a lot of surgeons who are left-handed.
Oh, interesting.
Not a lot of OBGYNs who are left-handed. So I have this kind of creative space, but I was focusing just on my left brain, using my analytical mind for all these years. And it was like, this doesn't seem fun anymore for me. Like, I can do the things. I can do the surgery. I can do the tests. I can take all of that stuff and put it to use, but this isn't serving me. This is very, serving my ego in some ways, but this isn't really the real full creative expression of my unique self. And so all of that together really compelled me. I actually went through a very depressive time. And then, of course, COVID happened shortly thereafter. And I found myself looking everywhere for an out, like an out of this.
Out of medicine?
Out of medicine, yeah. It was like, maybe I'll start something new. I don't know. Maybe I'll try to get rich writing a book. That doesn't usually happen. It was like, let me just explore what else I can do, because it seemed like my skill set was very, very particular to this job. And fortunately, or unfortunately, at the time it felt unfortunate, I was fired during COVID for having taken off my mask, caring for somebody who was 95, dying of heart failure. The next day, fired on the spot.
Wow.
And at first that was like, oof, this is bad. But now I should be sending them floral bouquets, because it really was the final nudge I needed to go and do something that was more important to me. And so I got back into birth work, but I started doing home birth and supporting midwives around the country. And in many states, midwives can't work autonomously unless they have a doctor who's, quote, supervising them. But many people probably can appreciate that midwives are better than I am at upwards of 85% or more of pregnancies, which are all the low-risk births. So if you need a surgeon or if you have a disease, go to a doctor. If those don't suit you, a midwife is going to be great. The problem is that states are mandating that midwives do certain things that really strips them of their autonomy. And autonomy is really the name of the game for giving birth. So I found my niche there. I could be the supervising doctor or the delegated authority or whatever you want to call it in a variety of states, and support midwives. And I found that to be like, okay, this is it. This is on the right path. But then I also kept training. I went and did a whole bunch of very esoteric training, like within anthroposophic medicine. We were talking about Waldorf school earlier. Steiner also gave way to this anthroposophic. It's kind of like a homeopathic way of looking at healing. I'm also studying traditional homeopathy now, but also a lot of functional medicine and the exercise sciences and nutrition and all these other things. And it was like, okay, I have my niche here. The people who invited me to Austin are people who really, really, really want to take some accountability for their health so that they can have the healthiest pregnancies. First off, get pregnant naturally, have the healthiest pregnancies, give birth in whatever way they want, having as many options on the table as possible. And I feel like this is where I've been led this whole way. And I get to spend 3 hours with my clients whenever I want to, as opposed to 7 minutes, which is the average that people get to spend with their doctors.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
Yeah, everything's driven by money, It's not driven by care.
Right.
Wow. Why do you think Western women's sexual and reproductive health care looks the way it does right now? And I mean, we just touched on that, money, but why do you think we're in this pickle?
I think it comes down to safety. We have slowly developed this notion that the worst thing that can possibly happen is death. But there's a lot of people in the world that would say otherwise. People living in conflict zones, people who have suffered, extreme morbidity at the hands of a surgeon or whatever else. Meaning, for example, let's say that from an unnecessary C-section, you end up with drop foot, like your leg just doesn't operate as it would anymore, and you trip, or you have chronic neuropathic pain or whatever. Remember, I'm also an end-of-life and palliative care physician, so I've seen and worked with people who for decades have said, I wish I could die, because that would be better than this. So this notion that death is a failure of the medical sciences goes against our very nature as human beings. And through the lens of safety, we have perpetuated this notion that if we have just enough technology and pharmacies and facilities and surgeons around, that we can keep you safe. And when we implement those things, we do mean to keep you safe. But it turns out that feeling safe is more important than being kept safe. So if we in this studio didn't feel, like, I don't know, we needed an armed gunman over here, at the doorway, that might keep us safe. But I don't know if I would feel that safe with somebody walking back and forth with a giant machine gun. If you were to take that and transpose that on the hospital experience, everything there is being done to keep people alive, right? Keep them safe through a very narrow lens of safety being not dying. If something is unsafe, it means that you might die. But a lot of those implements don't permit people to feel safe. And what I was trained to do definitely doesn't make people feel safe. It doesn't keep people wanting to come back for more. So a question I would have for you, and maybe you can share a little bit of your own birth story that you've shared, is why are so many more people now deciding to have home births when we have this obviously very safe building that you can go and guarantee safe passage through this rite of passage of childbirth? So we'll park that question, but could you remind me a little bit about your decision-making in your pregnancy?
Well, I had two different pregnancies, and I had two different births. They were very similar in some ways and very different, so it depends which one you want to talk about.
Yeah.
My first pregnancy, well, actually, it wasn't my first pregnancy, but my first live birth, I should say, was actually quite hard. I was pregnant with twins. I had sciatica. I have a small frame. I had a really huge, ginormous belly. The last 2 months, I think I just slept upright. I couldn't sleep.
Like a vampire.
Yeah. I mean, literally a pillow in my head in the pillow for 2 months.
Yeah.
I was really strong in my body. I was doing yoga. I just knew how I wanted to birth. And I had a really clear idea, despite being told that twin pregnancies are high risk and I needed to do it a certain way, especially in America. I was being told that I couldn't get a midwife, that I was told that I had to have a C-section. I was told that I had to have drugs. I was told all these things, and I was like, no. I think I know my body could do this. I don't need drugs. My mother birthed me with no drugs. My grandmother birthed her with no drugs. I don't, that's my choice, right? And was basically told no, this is how it needs to be because it's a high risk twin pregnancy. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I know I'm not getting in the hospital there,
Yeah.
Because for me, well, I also grew up with a father who was a surgeon. So for me, I was completely aware, especially when you don't have anybody around you to advocate for you. Once you step through that door, they can do whatever.
Right.
You are at their whim. And I wanted to have some agency and I wanted to have some power in this birth.
Right.
So I really searched far and wide for somebody in the U.S., a provider that could birth me the way I wanted to be birthed, and I couldn't find anybody.
How did you want to be birthed?
I wanted to birth vaginally with no drugs and use my body and not feel like a sick person.
Yeah.
Because I'm pregnant, I'm not sick, right?
Yeah.
So I really fought hard, and I was training, right? I was doing all the things. I was doing my meditations, my visualization, my pain management, all the things you would do, just like you would do for a marathon. I was doing all these things to kind of get ready to be able to do it the way I wanted to. And I got to about 35, 36 weeks in the U.S. I asked, what if I refuse? What if I refuse drugs? What if I refuse a C-section? And I was told that, well, if we have any inclination that the baby's lives is at risk, we have the right to go against your will. And I was like, no.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Get me out of here.
Yeah.
So
it's a classic sort of scenario that's unfolding. But go on, because I remember the climax here, and that's actually, I think, really important.
Yeah. So my father being a surgeon, I called him up and I said, here's where I'm at, I'm almost 36 weeks pregnant and I don't want to birth here. Like, I'm not finding anybody who is, and midwives were like out of the question because it's too high risk and they don't take on higher risk pregnancies. So he said, okay, here's 4 different numbers of 4 different OBs. This is in Beirut. And I want you to call these numbers, take an appointment, have a consultation with all of them, and see if any one of these doctors will respect your wishes, will respect what you want. And that's what I did. And 3 of them said the same thing that they said here. And one of them, that had been like a dean of the department, probably in the 60s or 70s, I can't remember. But I told him about I absolutely don't want a C-section. He said, well, when I was dean of the university, my C-section rate was like 3% or 4%. And I'm super adamant about that being a last resort if it's absolutely needed. And I felt really respected and felt really heard. So at 36 weeks, I got on a plane and afraid I don't birth on a plane.
Can't imagine like the flight attendants' faces.
Oh
They're
my
like,
God.
oh my gosh, we're going to be on this plane for X number of hours, and she looks like she's
Well, here's the
gonna have a
thing.
baby.
People couldn't tell I was pregnant. I think because I have this small frame and I wear like kind of baggy clothing, not very many people could tell I was pregnant, even though like literally if I just did this, you'd be like, oh my God.
That's a baby in there.
Or multiple.
2.
Yeah. But, I just wore baggy clothes and stuff. And, I think I kind of got away with it a little bit,
Yeah.
but I literally was like, please, universe, let me not birth on this plane. And I got there and I basically got the birth I wanted. I got an unmedicated, untethered, I was like, I don't want a hospital gown. Like, I'm doing my squats, I'm doing my thing, and, and that was the kind of the first birth. And then the second birth, I was planning on doing the same kind of going back to Beirut, where I grew up to do the second birth, but then some work kind of got delayed. And then I was like, shoot, I'm here, I'm in Portland, and I don't really have somebody, just in case I deliver early.
Yeah.
And that's when I found a midwife because I was carrying a singleton. And I literally met with her and we just talked briefly for maybe an hour about my situation. And the next time I saw her was when I told her my water broke. So I basically birthed at home my 3rd child, and it was with a midwife, and I was able to, catch my own baby. And, so I had, a hospital birth and a home birth, but they both felt like I had agency, and I felt respected and empowered in that experience. And I think that's really what every woman should be able to feel, that they had a say in how they do whatever they want to do with their lives and however they want to do it. And if a C-section was what I wanted to do, I should be able to have that. But if, if I wanted to birth a different way, I should be able to have that too. So
What were some of the feelings when you had your baby in your arms? What were some of the feelings that were coming through? I mean, you're kind of one foot in the astral, of course, but like, tell me, just let it kind of flow. What did it feel like? Because I want to wrap this into the problem with the medical system, which you had asked me about.
So obviously I had 2 different births. The first one that was in the in the hospital, I went there and I knew I had the support of my father, which was huge. Obviously I had the surgeon that respected my wishes, but I also had the support of my father, and my father was going to advocate for whatever I wanted. So I definitely felt protected. I definitely felt safe, and I definitely felt like I had people, my partner, my father, different people advocating for me. So I knew that I wasn't going to just get gobbled up. And when that baby, comes to you, I mean, the experience was a little different in the 2 different ways I birthed, but was definitely one of just pure joy and ecstasy. I wish I could bottle that feeling, because I think if everybody could feel what I felt, the world would be a very different place, I just felt so overwhelmed with joy and overwhelmed with, I don't know, birth is such a portal. It's such a portal of feeling like it is a death for sure. I mean, I felt that 100%. I definitely felt the death, but I also felt connected to every single living thing on this planet. And I just wish everybody could feel what I felt, could feel as safe as I felt in both of these births that were quite different. But I felt safe, and I felt protected, and I felt cared for, and I felt people were watching out for me. So I could just be and enjoy this moment that just happened.
Right. So there's this strange juxtaposition, I think, whereby in a true initiation, death is on the line. The issue with that, from the medical system's standpoint, the reason I think we've gone just so far askew from maybe what our clients, and I don't call you patients because you're not sick by virtue of being pregnant. I think that where we've gone astray is that we hear the word safety and we hear death is on the line. And we see the death of a mom or a baby, which obviously is one of the most catastrophic, tragic things I think that anybody can imagine going through, as a failure of the medical sciences. And so as a consequence, we're going to do things to you in order to keep you and your baby safe in the measurable ways that we equate safety, right? Blood loss, infection, whatever your blood pressure is, all of those types of things, forgetting that there's actually other layers of safety that are consequentially going to be compromised when we only are looking at healthy mom, healthy baby. So going back to what we were talking about with safety, when a person feels unsafe, their physiology changes. Now, it's no surprise, many people have heard that, right, if you're looking at mammals out on the savannah and there's a predator afoot, that perhaps labor stops and the cheetah or lioness can run and find safety, right? Where they feel safe, and therefore their physiology will respond in kind, and they can have their baby, right? That is important. But again, this is an initiation. So naturally a person is going to feel like, perhaps I'm dying here. And one of the lines that
I definitely have said that I've definitely said I'm dying, and my partner said, not today, honey.
A lot of people say that, it's like one of those transcendent experience, transcending. Like there's an end to this person, that the version of me, transcending of Nathan, and a new Nathan is being born. So there is nothing safe about that transformation. Any real initiation where death is on the line is not safe, but it's not supposed to be safe because it's transcendent. It's the chrysalis and the butterfly, that whole story. Like, there's nothing safe, caterpillar, about going into that thing. You're going to make that chrysalis, you're going to turn into a bunch of goo, and your 16 legs turn into 6 legs, and you grow wings and you're going to fly away. That sounds pretty darn scary for the caterpillar. But it's also just the process of growth and development and progress, whatever you want to call it. So there's this other thing that's interesting about this safety thing, which is that you, for some reason, didn't feel compelled to be in a hospital despite this advertised safety. And what's interesting is a lot of doctors, what I was conditioned to believe is that women who want to have out-of-hospital births with a midwife or free birth, perhaps, that they're irresponsible, they're stupid, they're uneducated, they're irresponsible, but you were actually taking so much accountability for how you were showing up in your birth. You mentioned the yoga, and you probably were eating healthier, and you were
all of it,
doing all of the things to make sure that your temple was prepared for this initiation.
Oh yeah, I took full responsibility.
Right. And I don't know if I, as a resident, as a young OBGYN, if I appreciated just how much work these women having home births were putting into their process. And so the other little part of this shift, this transformative shift for a new parent, which I hope people who are going to be parents someday will hear this, is we go from self-preservation at all costs, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It's the lost boys, I call them, the 28-year-old men who look great without shirts in the woods, and they are fit and ready to take on the world. You get a rapid shift from self-preservation to keep this child alive at all costs. And so due to that, which is not something that happens on a conscious level necessarily, due to that, it's very easy for me to say, oh, it's too risky to do this. In order for us to keep you safe, we need to do it in this way. And subconsciously, we accept that, even if it doesn't feel intuitively right. Not to mention the next layer of this, which is that so many women, from the time that they're little girls, have to, for the purpose of self-preservation, have to just nod and smile and appease the myriad of men that come their way just to survive in a world where they don't feel safe. So there's a lot of people who don't feel safe up until the point that they have a baby, or any time in their life maybe. And when you don't feel safe, for the same reasons we talked about with the lioness on the prairie or the savannah, your physiology changes. And when your physiology changes and you're always in a state of threat, you can't optimally connect, make love, or be the fullest version of you, including having a baby. So feeling safe is really, really important.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think when we spoke earlier, you were saying how we're just taught that, somebody throws on a white coat and we're just supposed to they're the expert and we're not, and we have to listen to them. And that really was touching to me, because I do feel, not just in the medical space, in every space, we are taught that things on the outside of us are right, and we're not taught to trust our intuition. We're not taught to trust our gut. Everything on the outside is right, and everything on the inside is debatable,
Right. Yeah, it's like your subjective experience really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But again, when I ask people about their births, they're not telling me their objective reality. And so this was hard learned by me. And since we're kind of on the topic and we had brought up the business of birth control, one of the big issues I had with birth control was at a very young age, when your body is just trying to connect itself with the rhythms of nature, we're now going to put some synthetic endocrine disruptors, which is actually what they are, into your body for the sole purpose of you to not have to experience being a woman. Which is a really sad thing to have to say out loud, because I have 2 little girls at home. And I don't want them to have an unintended pregnancy. I don't want them to go through all of that either. And it's hard to now look at mother culture, which tells us that this is actually an important part of reproductive justice, which it is. But simultaneously, sprinkling this about like Johnny Appleseed without really discussing what it means to disconnect young little girls at the age of 14 or 15 from the rhythms of nature, through which they could actually appreciate who they are, fully establishing who they are. And they may never even have a full menstrual cycle until they're 25 when they come off and they're ready to start having kids. And then, of course, there's the myriad of fertility issues and everything that may follow. But the point here is that we don't want you to be in touch with your magic. We don't trust your magic. Leave it to the white coats. Leave it to the people with the big old brains that did all the have all the credentials and whatnot. And of course, now you're expected to advocate for yourself in the throes of labor to an authority figure like me and say, no, thank you. It's a lot harder, I think, done than said.
Yeah, and then layer on top of that, we don't teach girls or women about how their bodies work or how their cycles work, and that they can actually learn how to not get pregnant if they don't want to get pregnant. But all that knowledge is
that could be middle school health. That could be, but it's not.
But
Instead,
it's not.
Run away from your sexuality. Don't embrace it and become responsible, empowered females. Because a responsible, empowered female, I'm married to one, is a force of nature. And that scares the hell out of a patriarchal sort of establishment.
Absolutely. We definitely cut off women from their power on purpose.
Yeah.
For sure.
You scare the hell out of us.
As we should. On this topic of somebody wants to have a child, somebody wants to, have an informed pregnancy, there's so much information out there that just feels so overwhelming.
Yeah.
Where can a birthing person know where to start?
Well, I think we could look at this from a variety of different views. I had just had somebody earlier, actually, as we were in the studio preparing for this, somebody text me and say, hey, we're looking to start getting pregnant. Can I get my hormones checked? And And that's a little bit of a pet peeve for me because it gives a little bit too much credit to the hormones. Now, granted, hormones probably do play a role, but I think that we're forgetting, again, about the immeasurable, facets, sometimes obstacles to having a really rich pregnancy or fertility all the way through postpartum experience. So when couples come to me and they have a glimmer in their eye, and somebody listening here might have a glimmer in their eye, want to have kids someday, it is time right now to completely shift your priorities in order to trying to promote as much of a healthy future for yourself and your baby as you possibly can. So this is where the obvious things of removing toxic stuff from the environment, eating more nourishing foods, drinking clean water, all of that stuff.
Microplastics. Nail polish.
Nail polish, the parabens, the neuroendocrine disrupting plasticizing agents, the parfums, start to get that out of your house. But to me, that is where people have stopped the conversation, because ultimately I've had people who have $1 billion in their bank account and they've got more fancy shit in their house, from the red light to the sauna to all the stuff, and they're still struggling. In fact, sperm count is low and the cycles are off and all of that. And what I would like to impress upon people is that there's far more magic here than we're willing to accept. Which is why some couples will try this, for a year, try to have sex at the right time, track the cycles, and there's nothing happening. So they come to me or a fertility specialist, like an REI doctor, and they'll, describe their story. And after the consult, the next time they have sex, they get pregnant. There was almost like an alleviation of the burden that they were putting on themselves, which is an unnecessary pressure and anxiety that we carry. Like, what if I can't get pregnant? What if it doesn't happen? All these things. And so what I have couples do is I want people to connect again, and not just have regular sex, but to really connect intimately. And for the guys out there, first off, probably over 50% of fertility issues are due to the dudes, and we're not giving them enough appreciation for their role in this. But I want the guys to also remember something that it took me a long time to learn, which is that your sexual encounter with your romantic partner is a consequence of intimacy. It's a consequence of you having connected for maybe hours to days to weeks before that encounter. And when you get married and you're doing this thing, you're not having sex like you were in college, but you might be with somebody you've been with since you were in college. And the sex has the opportunity to be that much more extraordinary. But you've just gotten through this process of okay, we're going to have sex now and we go to bed. If you can see sexual intercourse, which is obviously the way that babies are conceived naturally, as a consequence of you connecting, then the baby is going to come as an outcome of the love and connection that you and your partner are sharing. This is really at the heart of what's called conscious conception, where perhaps, as just a thought experiment, since we don't know where babies come from, and it's clearly not just a biochemical process, perhaps there's a baby floating up there in outer space, I don't know, who's saying, oh, that's going to be my mom and dad, but they're not ready for me yet. So just as a thought experiment, what if that spirit baby, and many women, by the way, when you really give them your ear, they'll tell you, I'm feeling like a baby, like a spirit of a baby coming through. Maybe you've felt that before. A lot of women, after they're finished having babies, still feel a baby coming through. Sometimes the men feel it as well. And so if that baby's trying to come through, maybe that baby has an opinion as to how things are going to go. And personally, I would love to hang out with a couple that is going to go out and have fun, rather than a couple that doesn't like to have, casual talking over dinner. We're just sitting there eating dinner, right? So maybe that baby's waiting for you and your partner to actually connect, to remember just how important this divine unity of the feminine and the masculine is. And maybe it's not the finances that your spirit baby's worried about. In fact, probably not. It's probably actually worried about, are you guys actually enjoying your time together? Because you have to keep me alive for 18 years. Maybe the baby's just, even if we're looking at it so simplistically, maybe the baby's waiting for that. And so there's not a lot of intimacy nowadays. It could be hand-holding. It could be falling in love all over again. There's this author that I've been really, really inspired by recently. His name is Mark Gaffney, and he wrote a book called A Return to Eros. He's actually a Hebrew mystic. And he talks about these levels of eros, where he's like, listen, you meet somebody in a bar and you guys are just so allured to one another and you just go at it for every single day for the next 2 weeks. But at some point, whether it's 2 weeks or 2 years, you sort of start getting tired of that. And you think, oh, maybe this isn't the person for me. I've fallen out of love, or I don't have the butterflies anymore. I want the butterflies for the rest of my life, so I'm gonna go find somebody else. And they go and start it again. And then it goes the same way and it starts again. So when it gets to that level 2 eros, there's the hard work of really connecting with a person, which is very, very hard. And my wife and I, we met when we were 15. We had to go through the gauntlet. And anybody who's been in a long, committed relationship, and by the way, there are good reasons to get out of marriages, don't get me wrong, but this is my person. There is so much of an attraction there, but simultaneously this repulsion at times where it's like, you see me for everything I am, and it makes us fight like cats and dogs, right? So if we're able to do that work, you end up as sort of like, this is like the path of Tantra. You end up in level 3 eros, where you're an 80-year-old couple walking through Madrid in the plazas and like holding hands and kissing at the fountains. That's what we all want, but we're not all of us are willing to go through that hero's journey. And so what I want people to remember is that the way that you procreate, the way that you conceive is also the way that this child's life is going to go. And that is the starting point for the conception journey. So it's not just a matter of putting sperm in an area where an egg might be met. It's far more beautiful and elegant than that. And there's this guy, Thomas Verney, who's a psychiatrist. He's written like 12 books or something now. I just met him recently on a panel, since somebody asked about IVF, and Dr. Verney very, very quickly stepped up and said, this tendency towards assisted reproductive technologies, while it may be necessary, these are my words I'm adding in, while that may be necessary sometimes, it has become now a trend to do that. I think if we can just acknowledge that there's something magical about how babies are made and that it's not just a mechanical process, I think it can set the stage for some really, really in-depth conversation and really deep inward reflection as to what this even means to us. And I'll finish by saying that sometimes the best way to get this process going is to write a mission statement. For you and your partner to each write something down. What does this mean to you? Because you're not entitled to have children. It's a really sad reality. You're not entitled to have kids. Once you can get this mission sort of on the same page and you guys can start falling in love again together, maybe everything else will kind of fall into place. Maybe it's not just a matter of which supplements to take. Maybe the baby just wants you guys to do something together for once. I think there's a lot of truth there for a lot of couples.
Fascinating. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
How can we help women know their rights, especially during pregnancy and even like a traditional hospital birth?
Yeah, we have a lot of young women, I think, that are being told on Instagram and whatnot, you have to fight for your rights and you have to advocate and you have to puff your chest and don't let them do things to you. But for the reasons we've already described, I think it's really, really, I think it's not fair to demand that of women going into the hospital system. So the question is, how can we inspire women to know their rights? Well, let's first talk about informed consent. So this is all the rage right now is informed consent. And when we talk about consent, it's not just saying yes to something, it's also having the ability to say no. So the big piece of advice I have for women going into the hospital system is to remember that informed consent is pretty darn simple. You need to be provided the risks, benefits, and alternatives to a procedure or an intervention, as well as the consequences of not doing that intervention. And then you should be supported in your decision, and your right to refuse that intervention also be honored. In other words, you can't be coerced to do this thing against your will. And if you can frame almost everything that anybody has ever experienced with a doctor in that lens, you can probably see there have been times in your life where you don't really feel like you were given full informed consent. But the people who do this, generally do this very, very well, are midwives. because they get way more time. There's no reason for them to want you to do this in this way or that way. They really are there to support you, which sounds like that was your experience with your midwife as well. Some of the phrases that come to mind are, if we don't do this, your baby might die. Well, that feels a little coercive, because nobody wants their baby to die for the reasons we just described. You have this shift in your consciousness where you now are going to put your baby's life ahead of everything. But if we do that unnecessary C-section, let's say, and the woman is traumatized, being strapped down crucifixion style, and maybe doesn't have adequate anesthesia. I'm feeling it. You can't be feeling it. I gave you all the medicine. Hold still, whatever. There's all these horror stories that emerge. If you're not given this sort of full perspective on what this means or doesn't mean, then we potentially can traumatize a lot of women in non-physical ways or physical ways. And that can also lead to a whole bunch of downstream issues. So you have the right to say no to absolutely everything.
No.
And no. Yeah. There is no real thing such as, you might hear it called implied consent. By virtue of walking into the hospital, you still have the right to say no or yes.
But there's so much fear
everything.
around that, right? Going back to like learning to appease and learning to fawn and learning to, it's like, how do I say no to this authority figure?
Right. I like to tell people to practice in their homes, even with their intimate partners. Just start saying no, thank you, which is something that you have 9.5 months maybe to practice. But you maybe didn't practice that for the first 28 years of your life or whatever. And now it's time to start really practicing saying no, thank you, and meaning it. And even the most curmudgeon-y OBGYN, when somebody knows who they are and they really know what they stand for and they say no, thank you, you're suddenly in control now. The doctor is going to know that you have remembered your magic and the real power you have. Like, you're growing a baby. I can't grow a baby. And if you can remember that, we suddenly now are going to hold some reverence again for that. But it's not something that you start practicing at 38 weeks whenever your waters open up. So that's a big part of the counseling I do for both my male and female clients, the families.
So how do we let women know the options that they have outside of birth? The dominant, view is hospital birth.
I think a big reason that women don't feel, safe in childbirth is because we're only really talking about the negative stuff. Most people are only hearing about that horror story of this happening in Atlanta or this happening in Austin or whatever. It's that like one in maybe a couple hundred bad things that happens. And so I think in order for women to appreciate and for men to appreciate the opportunity here, for them to show up, I think we need to start telling our stories more. That's why I think it's so great that you're doing this show, because this whole notion of healing can't happen if people don't feel safe. And right now, I think there's a lot of reasons that our general culture, in medicine, in healthcare or otherwise, just don't feel safe. There's this milieu of messaging around, horrible things are happening, and they're going to happen to you as well if you don't do X, Y, Z. And birth is no exception. So what I try to encourage people to do is to really tell your story. Birth and death are the two things we never talk about around the dinner table. And maybe we should change that. We don't even have any more rituals, and therefore we're not acting out any myths. Like, we have no story of who we are. But birth and death really are appropriate, I think, for us to talk about. Let's just remember, memento mori, you are going to die. And that's okay. There's actually a privilege to that. But if you're going to just push the conversation down the road, then when it happens, you're not ready for it, similar to with birth. So I think storytelling, changing our mother culture, this milieu of messaging, I think is critical. I don't think it's like a luxury. I think this is actually necessary, because if we want to change anything in the world, we're going to have to get birth right first and foremost. So all these other issues that seem to be plaguing us in the media and everything, I don't think that we're going to touch those, because we have a faulty foundation as to how babies are even coming into the world. So I would just like people to know that, yes, it feels unsafe in the hospitals, but we can make you feel safer while you're going through the rite of passage, which naturally, here's the conflict, naturally isn't safe.
Inherently the world is unsafe.
Yeah.
Everything's unsafe.
If safety is not dying, then the most unsafe thing you could have done was be born. So let's get away from this, just this myopic view of what safety is, and let's start living again and really embracing like the richness of what these rites of passage are, the few rites of passages that we have. Let's start embracing it as an opportunity, not something to be afraid of, which is probably easy to say as a person who's never going to give birth. But I've been through it twice with my wife and thousands of times with other women. And so many women say it was so healing to finally reclaim my autonomy in this.
Birthing kids has been a huge part of my healing story for sure. What does a birth with agency look like?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, let me say that the last birth I went to was a couple months ago, and I didn't even have to put a pair of gloves on. So the agency in that room was way beyond what you see in most situations. They had prepared so well in order to almost like earn the privilege of doing nothing. A birth in which there's a lot of agency being exercised is one that we don't see a lot in the hospital system. Because I think for you to exercise your agency, the way that your dad helped you, support you, is by you being at the center of the conversation. Most of the time in the hospital, this is a generalization, but most of the time, the birth plans, all the doulas and everything else, it seems like it's almost an affront to the authority of the doctors or whatever. I remember doctors who trained me kind of scoffing about requests, like birth plans and whatnot. Like, you would never walk onto an airplane and hand the pilot a set of instructions for how to fly the plane. Why are you doing that for me? But it's not even a fair metaphor, right? Because even the doctor's not in control of this. And so a person who exercises agency is somebody who really knows who they are, and they really know what they want. They and their partner have done the mission statement. They really are on the same page. They see one another through and through for what their role is in this dance that is childbirth. And when you see that, you almost are compelled to get out of the way. But we can't do that if we're not willing to put the birthing families at the center of the conversation and to rally the horses and all of the resources around them to ensure that we are in service to them and they are not in service to us.
You speak of radical responsibility. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
If we want to make decisions for ourselves, we also have to honor and own the outcomes of those decisions. I don't care what people do or don't do. What you need to do if you're going to make a decision for you or your family is to also realize and recognize that whatever the outcome of that decision is, that's also yours to own. So real freedom through the lens of radical accountability and responsibility is doing everything in your power to keep your options open for the future. And that might require you to make a decision that ultimately has a bad outcome. The way that this plays, to sort of embellish this analogy, say a person who came to me for help in the hospital is having a baby, and there's a fetal heart rate monitor that shows the baby's heart rate is down. I might run in there and say, if we don't do a C-section right now, your baby will die. They might say, I do not consent to that. No, thank you. I don't believe in that. And that's okay. If the baby were to die, they would then also have to own that their decision led to that outcome. I would have to acknowledge this person made their own decision despite my recommendations and despite all of this other stuff. You are a woman of flesh and blood, and it is your prerogative what happens to your body. I cannot cut into your body with a sharp instrument without you saying, I not only consent, but I'm like, ready, let's go. It's like an enthusiastic hell yes. Radical responsibility requires that we own not just our decisions because we are of sound mind, but also that we recognize that whatever the outcome of that decision, given that you and I have different thresholds for risk, that you're going to own those decisions. Well, it's a radical conversation in and of itself.
Yeah, for sure. I want to get into a little bit the role of the partner and specifically men in childbirth.
Yeah.
Because when we were talking earlier, you really spoke to something that really kind of touched me. Could you get into that?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot I could say about the man in childbirth, and I think most of the time it's sort of a preparation of the house, making sure that the room is decorated, and then when the baby starts to come, there's pressure points, and there's these certain things that men can do to be very supportive. But before I actually say what I believe, let me also say that people think that I was probably the best partner, and I was the worst.
Really?
I screwed it up. And the reason was that my wife and I have known each other, like I said, since we were 15. And it always seemed like I would dominate the thing. Like if she did martial arts, I would do martial arts, and I would do I would exceed at it. She wanted to go to this country, I would go there, and then I would learn the language. It was kind of one of those things that I didn't even realize I was doing. And so there's these like little conflicts that arose throughout our whole lives. And now, fast forward to our 30s, we're going to have children. And she had said something subtle to me, Mira, that was kind of like, I want this to be my thing. Like, you're now an expert in childbirth, and now I can't just have my baby, right? So I had like 20 books sent to me, like everybody and their mother sent me their books. And she was like, no, like just wasn't into reading about it. She's very healthy, like took care of herself and everything, but just didn't want to know the nuts and bolts. And so I took the opportunity to say, well, maybe I'll just step back from this and I'll just let her run with it, and I'll just be behind holding her coattails. Well, I withdrew so much that she actually felt like I completely disconnected from her. And so in counseling a lot of men, I want to encourage them not to think of their role here as if there's some sort of problem that they can solve, which is what most of the men in our lives really model for us, is we're the Mr. Fix-Its, right? I want to encourage men to think of what is the opportunity for you to be so deeply connected to somebody and to help make them feel safe. Maybe it's just guarding the door to make sure that nobody's distracting you and you can go inward in that prayer pose and push your baby out on all fours. That could be it. But just bearing witness to what they're going through. And the ultimate expression of the masculine is not Mr. Fix-It. The ultimate expression of the masculine is to keep the feminine safe. Because as we've described, the power that you brought into birthing your babies, all three of your babies, is something that we have no ability to do. So much so that, since the dawn of written human history, women have been stripped of this power through the church, through the state, and a myriad of other ways. So for a man to really want to show up in the best way, what I would encourage people, men, or the masculine dominant partner, we can say, to show up is to not just think about the touch and the lemonade and the sage and all of the stuff that you can do, but also to recognize that if you can make this person feel seen and that you're witnessing what they're going through at the sort of cost of their old identity, it's going to mean quite a bit for your relationship. And even in the throes of labor, the masculine's role, the ultimate flex and test of your masculinity, is to not jump in to solve the problem, but to actually sit back and just bear witness and be present with the process. And when you can do that, it will change you as a man forever, which you can't get from TV even if it was a conversation piece. You really can't appreciate just what it feels like to be there watching your woman transform. And I don't say your woman in a possessive way. I mean the person that you're the greatest love is dying in front of your eyes and being reborn as a lioness. And you see them roaring. There is a palpable feeling there. That is the test of the masculine, without jumping to save the day. So there's an opportunity there for men. And I hope that they can take advantage of it in ways that I actually didn't.
You were telling me earlier about how what you tell sometimes when partners come to you and the man specifically is maybe not agreeing or a little bit of conflict with what his partner wants to do, what you tell them to do. And I thought that was really insightful.
Yeah, similar to women having certain preconceived notions around what birth is like, I think men are not immune to that either. So there was this exercise that occurred to me one day. I don't even know where I came up with this. Probably heard it from somewhere, but don't think I would have believed it had I not started putting this into practice about 5 months ago. A big question I get on Instagram and email and everywhere, I mean, literally all the time on podcasts and everything is, say a partner's husband, we're talking about like the typical woman's pregnant, man's finished cutting the grass and he comes in and they have a talk about wanting to have a home birth. And he's like, oh, no. That's way too dangerous. It's perpetuating the same sort of safety messaging that we've been talking about. How do we convince him? And I don't have a way of convincing him. But what I can say is that if you ask that man, and women can do this as well, I encourage everybody to, because when I did it, it was like, whoa, go back to your mother or father, or both if they're alive, and ask them for your birth story. And have them tell it in their own words, just one all the way through. Just sit there, be present, grab some tea, and just be there with them. Give them full permission to speak. 'Cause sometimes our parents' generation, they're not as open to sharing the little inside pieces. They were never modeled that. But give them permission and ask inquisitive questions. And read it together. Just read it. Because what I've come to find is that exercise of learning the birth story allows you to acknowledge how your mother and father have been speaking about your birth since, for the past however many years you've been here, 35 years. And even before your ego was formed and your prefrontal cortex and whatever, before you actually had an identity, you were hearing these little quips about your own birth. I was, little Johnny split me from front to back. It was so painful. It was so scary. I was so uncomfortable. I never wanted to be pregnant again after that. You could create a list of 20 different, additional phrases. But the point here is that little Johnny has been hearing about how much pain and suffering he caused his mother. Which whether you're not into Freud's psychology, it doesn't really matter. That obviously is something that we can all relate to. Even if you don't have a great relationship with your mother on paper now, you would never want any harm to come to them. It's just a thing for both men and women. And so you're hearing that by virtue of you coming into the world, so much damage was done to the woman that you love more than anybody. And now your new partner here is going to have a baby. And it sounds like the worst idea in the world because of how unsafe this narrative has, the lack of safety and the lack of security, that the narrative you were told about your own birth, you've been imbued with this notion that this person is going to be harmed. And if a person is going to be harmed, we better get them to safety. And so once we learn our birth stories, I think we can start to unpack them and maybe even rewrite them with our parents, which I found is actually quite successful. And anybody listening can take this. I also think it's a way of reconnecting with our parents as a part of retelling sort of our whole story, which might draw your parents into the birth process in a kind of a unique way. And lastly, I'll say is that I think is sometimes actually healing for our parents to tell the story and then to ask more questions like, it sounds like it was really, really hard for you, Mom. This is me being the palliative care doctor now. That sounds like it was really, really hard for you. What other things do you remember about it? Like, what did I smell like? What was it like to hold me for the first time? Similar to what we were talking about with your birth. And then other things, the wheels start turning that they haven't actually exercised. Like, oh my gosh, it was like you were finally here. I was a mother finally. And your dad was, like, I heard my mother say that the only time I ever saw your dad cry was when he was holding you. And he said, he has my little butt chin. Like he was looking at my features and he recognized there was a part of him in my face. And that's an important part of the story, not just
the pain and
the suffering. So maybe that would help some men at least to reimagine what birth could be. And of course, then if they listen to these types of shows and they can connect with other people who have gone through this, you might also realize there's a lot of things that happen in the home that are so much better than what can happen in the hospital if you can just surrender to this largely uncontrollable process and just be the anchor, the mountain for your partner.
If you're enjoying the show, one of the best ways you can support us is by tapping those like and subscribe buttons and by leaving a comment or review. And don't forget to share this episode with a friend. Thanks for joining us.
A Black friend of mine recently shared that her one hope for her birth is to not die. Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. How can we support Black women and women of color specifically to have better chances at living, thriving, and healing through this process?
Oh, man. That is such an important question right now. I have a lot of Black female friends who have really struggled in the medical system because they're really desperate to find somebody that has a relatable lived experience. So the first thing I'll say to that, and this is not an easy answer. I mean, this is a super complicated thing. The story of J. Marion Sims, who's the father of gynecology, comes to mind. This was a antebellum South general surgeon before the advent of gynecology. J. Marion Sims wanted to make a name for himself and got his name by experimenting without anesthesia on Black enslaved women. And we didn't even know their names until recently. Betsy, Lucy, and Anarcha are the 3 that we know. And this is deeply personal for Black women, especially in our country. But adding on to this history, and really, systemic racism is woven into the very fabric of the United States. There's no question about that. So with that being said, a lot of Black women go through their lives living in a state of, we're referring to hyperarousal and on what, Stephen Porges in his work with polyvagal theory would describe as that you have this autonomic ladder that starts developing in the uterus and it's completed in the maybe first 6 months of life, 6 to 12 months. But the vagus nerve, helps you connect and love and feel like your fully embodied self on the ventral vagal end. And then there's the dorsal vagal, which is actually your freeze mechanism. And then in the middle, we have the sympathetic, the fight or flight. And we've all heard these terms before. Well, if a person is living in that state of flight or fight, or they're living, especially in the red and the lower, that actually is detrimental to your health long term. So we have a problem here. Because on the one hand, a lot of Black and otherwise non-white, non-straight white, Christian individuals, let's say, living in the United States, are living in a state of chronic low-lying stress, like low level, maybe imperceptible if you've lived with it, but it actually is a factor in your long-term health, physical, mental, emotional, and otherwise. So we have, in our literature, we would say, black skin is a risk factor. No. Your Black skin is not a risk factor. It's the systemic racism that treats you differently from others. And we're just now coming around to this, that is not a risk factor. It is the way that you are perpetuating racism in a pretty racist patriarchal society that is putting these women at risk. And people are going to argue about genes and all that. Forget about it. It's if Black women felt safer, they wouldn't have the same statistics. The other issue, of course, is due to this inherently sort of racist underlying thread that nobody wants to call out. A lot of healthcare professionals actually mistreat Black women. They misdiagnose. They completely underdiagnose certain things. The famous story is, I believe it was Serena Williams. She had a pulmonary embolism and had asked 3 or 4 times, like, something's wrong. I know my body. I'm a professional athlete. And they were like, no, it's just, postpartum, whatever. And she ended up having a big PE. But that's not how it goes for a lot of women who have lost their lives. There's a great film called Aftershock. And at my upcoming Born Free Twins Breach conference in Louisville, we're going to be screening this. And 2 of the individuals featured there, Omari Maynard and Shawnee Benton Gibson, they're going to be there for a panel discussion. But the reason that they're there together is Omari is his wife, Shamani, died of the exact same scenarios as Serena, and that was Shawnee's daughter. And now Omari is raising their children alone. Shamani's an advocate, and they put this film together to talk about the perils of being Black and this compelling mortality rate for pregnant and postpartum women who are non-white, but especially Black. So hospital workers don't realize that they're actually undertreating pain and that they're not listening and whatnot. And we try to assuage this through, training modules and this and that, but it's just not, it's not sufficient. So even, and for those that are kind of curious about this, for Black educated women, they have worse statistics than poor uneducated white women. Oh, so we definitely have a problem here. And so to answer your question, I think we need to actually put these things into conversation. We need to not be afraid to talk about them. We need to find compassionate ways of bringing it up. And I think that there are ways of providing reparations that are not just like, here's money. It's actually holding conversations around J. Marion Sims and around how we even got here from a historical perspective that can help the medical system reframe this problem, which is a very, very real lived situation for so many families. And then the last thing I'll say is that if we can appreciate the role of living in a state of threat and dread, if we can start by providing a healthcare resources in a context that actually does make people feel safe of all colors and races and creeds and everything, I think all of our statistics are going to get better because right now we're not doing all that great. Compared to every other developed nation, we have the worst statistics. There are some big issues in the United States, and unless we're willing to just say it for what it is, I think we're going to continue going down that path. And what unfortunately has happened is there's a lot of states that are further restricting autonomy of midwives and closing rural access to rural hospitals and clinics, which is where most of the women that are most desperately in need of like-minded, lived, experienced midwives and doctors, specifically like a Black midwife who maybe comes from a lineage of granny midwives, or what we call grand midwives now, caring for a woman who wants to have a home birth. They may just simply not be able to do that, and so they're compelled to go to the hospital where they know they're going to be mistreated because that's what happened in their previous 2 or 3 or 4 births. So there's a couple different directions I think that we can take, and I do kind of think we need to do it all at once. But right now our legislation, everything is not going in the right direction in the states that most need it.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. So I know we've touched on this, but, so many women are being traumatized in the hospital.
Yeah.
In the birthing process. How can we make birth less traumatic for women?
That's a lovely question.
What can we do?
Yeah. I think why don't we start by describing, maybe defining what trauma means. So very, very simply, trauma occurs when there is a stressful thing that happens to your body, but it's not integrated. So that means that comparing traumas is sometimes helpful, but not always helpful. That also means that something that seems relatively benign could ultimately result in something that is horrifically traumatic and actually leads to pathophysiology in the future because it was unresolved. So when people hear traumatic birth experiences, I think a lot of people are thinking the C-sections where women are strapped down and there's all this noise and maybe they're not fully anesthetized and then they have to be put under and it's this horrific thing. They feel dissociated and disconnected from their baby. And, I think that people think about that, or episiotomies or whatever. Somebody forcing their hand inside of you without you saying yes, right? Or maybe you saying yes but not meaning it. That's also very traumatic. There's a great OB anesthesiologist who was a mentor of mine in medical school. Her name's Tracy Vogel. She has a pro bono prenatal clinic in Pittsburgh. When I was in med school, I think she had just come from Stanford and started teaching at Allegheny Health Network. And she's an OB anesthesiologist, so she spends most of her time behind the curtain with women during C-sections. And she started seeing, clients coming back in for repeat C-sections and she was so beautifully compassionate and really good at this, and from hearing people's stories, she realized, oh my gosh, we're doing a lot of harm in the hospital system. Even when women are happy with their births and the outcomes, we have a healthy mom, healthy baby, maybe that's the best outcome anybody could hope for, except even when women weren't having C-sections, they were having natural, uncomplicated, undisturbed births in the hospital. There was something about it that didn't feel good. And it was so compelling that some of those people may even fly to Lebanon to have babies, right? This draws back into that question, like, are people having home births because they're irresponsible, or are they actually maybe not feeling as safe as you think they would be in a very well-stocked hospital? So as Tracy started exploring this, she realized, oh my gosh, everything that we're doing from start to finish makes people feel unsafe. So the reason I bring this up is when we think of traumatic birth experiences, it's hard to measure that because a lot of women say, I don't know what it was. It just didn't feel right. I don't feel like, they were speaking to me like a whole person. I don't feel like they were really seeing me. I feel like
Probably
I was...
the disrespect.
Yeah, just like, I don't feel like I was being respected and spoken to with respect or touched with respect. I don't really feel like I was being consented on anything. I don't really feel like I knew what the hell was going on. And that probably feels pretty bad when we're talking about an initiation, a transformation of spirit, childbirth. I mean, this is a big deal. So if pregnancy is a disease and birth is a medical procedure, we would have great statistics and everybody would love their hospital births, but that's not what we're seeing. And this is where Tracy and I have been flowing ever since I met her in med school. I think that this all comes back down to reimagining what would a birth scenario look like that felt optimal, ideal. And for those who are watching or listening, I think it's really appropriate to just pause right here, close your eyes and just imagine what does the room feel like? What are the lights? What is the sound? Who's there? How are you being touched? What are you tasting? Like, what is the environment? And my wife had me do this. We were walking on a trail with our first pregnancy, and she was like, so walk me through the birth. And what she was asking for me is to dream up what it feels like. And so naturally, in a very dumb doctorly way, I was like, well, you'll probably start having contractions and then your water will break. And, I kind of nerded out. And she was like, no. She cut me off. She was like, bro, you're not hearing me. Tell me, like, dream up what you're feeling. And I had never done that. But it's a really beautiful exercise, which actually is a birth plan. And most people don't come up with that dream-like scenario of bright lights and sharp things in the kid's feet and the kid being whisked away and measured and weighed and washed up before they even end up on your chest. Usually they say low lights, there's not a lot of noise. And nobody's talking unless we have to, and then we whisper. My little girl's right on my chest, where my little girl can co-regulate with me and help to establish their nervous system, where the baby actually, we have an environment where the baby in their first moments feels safe. That's the type of imagining that many of us will do. But if you're not being asked and there isn't an option, then perhaps we really can't make it safe for you. But what I would really love to do is take the whole healthcare system, take the maternity care system, get a think tank of people around a table, and have everybody do that exercise and say, okay, let's build a hospital that does that. Or we make midwifery the default. I actually think that's probably an easier path, which is why that's my path. Because changing this medical leviathan, which is profiting at the expense of the human experience, like, to each their own, it's capitalism. Everybody deserves to make money, whatever, I get it. But we're talking about birth here. And this is actually far more important than profits. We can argue profits for everything in our society except for this, in my opinion. So I think the easiest path would be, let's make midwifery care, really good midwifery care, the default. And then we still have our surgeons and operating rooms for those people who really need us. And they're going to be so grateful to be there. But let's help people dream up their birth, and let's rally the horses around that dream experience. That, to me, would be, I think, a way of minimizing the trauma that is being inflicted in our healthcare system.
Yeah, probably create a very different world, too.
Oh, my gosh. Imagine, little babies that feel safe
from the beginning.
From the very beginning. Imagine how our world would feel when you're not worried that your neighbor is going to hurt you, or that somebody's trying to get one up on you or whatever.
Somebody's going to take you away or whatever.
Somebody's going to steal you, rob you. Yeah, I mean, we're so siloed off and disconnected from one another. And it's probably because most of us never even felt connected from the moment that we came out. And that's not for people to feel shame or guilt or blame. It's just the reality. This stuff really, really matters. And that baby's nervous system can't tell the difference between being kept safe and feeling safe. Feeling safe is way more important. So let's put them back in the center, and let's reimagine what that would be like. And let's try to make that the default, whether it's in a home with a midwife or it's even in the hospital. And Tracy Vogel's actually trying to do that in the hospital. Props to her, because that to me is that's huge. It's a big leap.
So you seem to use a mix of different healing modalities. Is there any favorites? in particular relating to maternity care?
Oh my. I'm gonna go old school here, and I think people are probably hoping that it's gonna be like, oh, the energetic magic of homeopathy and all this. I actually think everything has its place. In fact, I'll preface what I'm gonna say by saying that I've done all this functional medicine study, and I have all the allopathic board certifications and all that. And my 2.5-year-old now is still struggling with loose stools for almost a whole year, but she's otherwise healthy, meeting milestones, talking, healthy teeth, healthy hair, and all this. But her stools are loose. And I have tried absolutely everything, Mira. Like I am really good at what I do, and I've fixed a lot of people's guts and whatnot, but there's no number of supplements or anything that I have been able to find that has helped her. It gets better, and then it gets worse, and then it gets better and goes back, So I do think that there are sort of karmic diseases, for lack of a better term, that are inherited. I think that there are issues in the etheric and astral, and how even the ego is sort of operating within our various organ systems and our whole human organism, which is anthroposophy. Homeopathy would be sort of removing the karmic traumas and whatnot. I think that there's really good reason to use all of those things. But until we do those things, I also think people need to be impressed with the importance of, let's just say, sleeping. I can't tell you how many times I've met people who, again, they've got all of the devices, all the supplements and whatnot. They think they're able to get away with 5 hours of sleep. And as soon as you get them sleeping and helping them mitigate stress.
Yeah, sleep is the foundation of the house.
Yeah. And not using sedatives like Xanax or Benadryl or even a lot of cannabis, but like really getting it back to the point where, your 3-year-old your 5-year-old probably has no trouble falling asleep. Why is that? It's because they don't really feel like any issues with the world. And I think we get so caught up in our stuff and productivity and whatnot. And I'm like a poster child for this. I've been in adrenal fatigue so many times. But if your body is not sleeping, it's not recovering. And if it's not recovering, it feels like it's either starving or it's being chased. And that gets back to the nervous system. And why would you be putting resources towards growing a baby, getting pregnant in the first place, recovering postpartum if you're being chased? So when you're not in that, and your nervous system is not being conditioned to believe that it's in a place of safety, and you're not recovering for those 8 hours of sleep per night. I tell people 9 hours plus for 3 weeks, and if they can't do that, I won't work with them. Now, there's going to be obviously situations in which that's going to be very, very hard, but the point here is go to bed early, wake up on time, and with the sun. And if you can do that, almost everything else that I've learned will just be that much more effective. So,
it's so interesting you say that, because I actually now, having, a decade has passed by, now I realize miscarriages actually had a lot to do with that foundation for me personally.
Tell me about that.
Especially when I think of this one miscarriage, I think of, I was working so much. I was very stressed. I was taking all the supplements. I was doing all the things, just to make up for the lack of sleep and stress and all this, all the impact of the things on my body. But then I wasn't doing this fundamental thing that actually nurtures and produces a human, right? My body was like, you don't even have enough energy for yourself. How are you going to have a baby? And that took a long time for me to even absorb and really, come to terms with, I guess, and how I needed to change certain things.
I think the gravity of a miscarriage is enough to change a person's entire worldview.
It did, totally. That's what happened to me.
I don't think that we doctors generally give enough attention to how catastrophic that can be for women, because we see them so often. So we say these little platitudes, like you can get pregnant again.
Yeah, or it's normal.
It's normal. That's what happens. Yeah. But man, it can really wake you up to, even going back to the soul contract of the baby. Maybe the baby was like, oh, mom's not ready. She's got other things. I don't want to be a burden on her. It almost makes me choke up a little bit saying that. But maybe, this little girl or little boy was actually trying to take care of you. by saying, "Oh, mom's just not ready. Mom has too much going on. I can't possibly be a burden for her. It's gonna harm her. It's gonna be injurious. It's gonna, her and dad are never gonna have time together, and I can't be the bearer of that." It's hard to reconcile that because we so desperately want to have children, but it could be very physically your hormones are all out of whack, and that causes a miscarriage. Sure, supplement with progesterone. We can do all those things. That's easy stuff. But what about this relationship? Remember, it starts when you get that glimmer in your eye. And so I'm not trying to impress any of those stories onto you, but it does make me wonder sometimes around some of these more imaginary things that are sometimes actually a great source of reconciliation, maybe, because I don't think we do a great job of.
No, and we don't grieve. We just kind of, something happened.
Yeah.
We just, something happened and we just move on because that's what we're supposed to do. We don't, our societies don't value grieving, death, loss. I know you work a whole bunch in that space too.
Well, it's interesting. We don't have to go down that path right now, but it's interesting how many gods and deities over, the written human history are both the fertility and death. They represent, Osiris comes to mind, which is like ancient Egypt. We had, numerous Greek deities. There was a recent Haitian god, like a voodoo god that I had heard. I think the name is Gede, Gede. Very, very similar story. But it's amazing how this has come up so many times in history, where death and birth and this essence of rebirth, is actually so critical. This cycle. But of course, grieving, I think the thing that we're probably grieving the most is the sort of lack of cultural identity. And I think the essence of our identity is in that cyclical nature, but it's just right now so scary for us to look at sometimes. If you even think about what happened over the past couple of years, we just all forgot about it.
Moved on.
It's
huge,
treacherous.
And there's so much lost there, and it took so much away.
Yeah.
So how has the journey of becoming a parent and experiencing the birthing process alongside your wife just enriched your understanding of life and relationships?
Well, I didn't do a great job, so it's now a primary focal point for us in our conversations. But also, in some ways, I kind of needed that in order to really... for the pendulum to swing back to the middle. Like I said, it was sort of like I was the dominant, the achiever, it was always about me, the Nate show, and then I withdrew completely, and now it's kind of in the middle. What I think it taught me the most was that my time is not my primary currency anymore. It's actually my presence. And so it's not just a matter of scheduling time with people, which we can do when we're 28 and we're college students and we're just trying to get our credentials and get our tests done and all of that. But now those little girls don't care whatsoever how much time I spend. I could spend all day, but if I'm on my phone the whole time or I'm not really there, and they know, that.
Oh, they know.
I don't know how they know, but they have that.
They know.
They know you're not there with them. But if you could spend 5 present minutes, it's worth 5 hours of your scheduled time. So that has been the number one thing for me. And also realizing that my wife really needs me to be present and co-regulating with her. If she's getting frustrated, I'll start breathing at her cadence. And somehow we fall into sync, and now we can have a hard conversation. As opposed to just being stuck up here and trying to figure out what's the right thing to say, which never works. Never works.
Never.
Presence. That's probably the biggest takeaway. The value of presence.
I know you talked about kind of how you almost were disconnected or went so far away with the birth of your daughters.
Yeah.
But how was that experience for you of bringing your daughters into the world?
I think I needed it to validate something I was feeling inside. It was kind of like, all right, smarty pants, you think you can do birth? You think you're really, really trusting in birth? You have to do it yourself now. And watching this young woman who I'd been with since she was 15 when we met, watching her go through that was a real honor and a privilege, but it was also the scariest thing in the world. Because up until the moment you're a father or a mother, you still are in self-preservation mode, which we've already kind of gotten into. But I'm watching this person go through the pain and the struggle and the exaltation in many ways of childbirth. And I don't even care about the baby yet. I'm like just so concerned that she's dying. So kind of what it looks like. I mean, they're not there anymore. You're watching them shapeshift in front of your eyes from maiden to mother. I think it was more about the relationship between me and my wife that was actually more important to me. Somehow I knew the babies were going to be okay, but I was almost like overly concerned maybe with her.
Are you going to be okay with her? Like, is your relationship going to make it through?
Yeah, is she still going to love me after this? Is she still going to want to be with me? And of course, for the man, something we don't realize is the moment of birth is actually going to go by like that. You now have a relationship with this person for the rest of your life. And their focus is not entirely going to be on you, mister. Doesn't matter how...
There's a loss there, too.
Yeah, there's a fracture in your relationship where you're suddenly now not the primary, the only priority. Yeah, in fact, probably not the priority at all. You're probably going to come second.
So low on the list, yeah.
So there was a reconciliation period for me and for us. I think that there were times when my wife was like, I can't just keep talking while they're screaming. And I'm like, but whatever. And maybe like my surgeon brain, I'm able to just block everything out and operate and do this while the kids are screaming and throwing food at us. But she found that really hard. And so, we've fortunately had an open channel for conversation and connection. But now we're at a place where we have to start prioritizing our relationship again, because we are going to outlive them. Our relationship is going to outlive them. But in the moment, I was really reconciling the transformation that was happening for me. And I think that's a huge affront to a lot of men. So you might even roll that into recommendation for men, is to remember you're not going to be the only thing that she's ever thinking about. Yeah. If anything, you might be third or fourth on the list now.
Yeah, and I think there's a grief there that I don't think partners realize that that's what it is, but there's definitely a grief there, because they not only have this new life, but they also have a new partner, and they also don't have the attention or the presence of this partner that just was theirs and only theirs.
Right, right.
There's so many losses. There's so many layers of loss there.
Yeah, and it's not like you suddenly know, like you now have a new role to take care of a baby. Like a lot of men don't have any idea what a baby needs. And it goes back to that presence thing. It's almost like you have to build trust with them so that they know that you're going to be there, ride or die, even if they're screaming in your face. There's no problem to fix with a screaming baby, usually. Diaper's clean, baby's burped, baby's fed. Maybe the baby's tired, but the baby just woke up and is screaming. And there's nothing you can do, so you just pass the baby on thinking they probably just need mom. But actually, I think my daughter was testing me. I think she was testing me by just screaming and screaming and screaming and seeing if I would just love her through her darkest times. And that was very confronting to my identity, not having the tools or whatever that she needed me to fix whatever issue was that there was. So this childbirth thing is important. It is a journey. It is way more than just a checklist. It is a full transformation for both of the individuals who made this baby, for the baby itself coming earthside, and for the family unit. And perhaps our entire community. If we could put pregnant families at the center, it would actually have a ripple effect. But instead they leave the hospital or whatever and go home, and now they're alone waiting for the meal train or something to start. And that's also very, very isolating.
So isolating, yeah. I've had men say to me, especially when like one of my kids is like having a complete meltdown, screaming, kicking, all of it. I'm just like there.
Yeah.
Just waiting for this thing to pass. Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you not lose your mind? I'm like, I'm pulling all the tools. I mean, it's like just as hard for me as it is for you, but it's just, you just have to like have a little toolbox of like, okay, breathe, this too shall pass, but just like be there so they know that you're not gonna, just because they're having their big feelings, you're not gonna leave them, Well,
I mean, when I see a man who's holding a crying baby, Like, I'm like, brother, I see you. Like, I get it. And there's a lot of other men who haven't had children, and I don't think that it's a hierarchy in any way, but it's like, I don't think that your masculinity has been tested the way that mine has. Maybe in other ways that I can't understand, but that is a real test.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
To not being able to fix this, but just holding a crying baby. And like, you know, I think we've all had that opportunity where it's just like, stop screaming. Like, honestly, you want to like squash them. And it's like, you can't do that. I can't do that. I have to just love you. And it's like, oh my God, this feels like insanity. But that's actually the exercise of parenting.
It totally is. How do they scream and trigger everything inside of you?
Like every last insecurity is coming up. Like, so that is like, that's where I think dads actually need, like, we have these men's groups that are popping up. I'm actually starting my own on Father's Day for our Born Free community for like new dads to just bear witness to one another. Like, you're doing it. You're doing okay. I know you probably don't think it, but you're doing fine.
I love that.
Yeah, I think it's needed.
How can we show reverence for moms?
So there's actually a double-edged sword here, a catch-22, where in order to operate, you have to objectify a person. And if you don't objectify them, you're like, okay, I'm cutting into a person's belly, and now I'm looking at their intestines. This is really weird, right? So you have to dissociate from the humanity of it. And then if you put that same surgeon now in a birthing space, it's hard for them to detach from that. And they have to objectify this person, not realizing that there used to be a reverence for the unique opportunity to be sitting with a person in their most vulnerable state. And so sexuality is actually a part of the care of birthing women, but it's not in the way that people maybe imagine. It's remember that this is a person that is trusting you in their most vulnerable state, to treat them with respect, to speak to them with respect, to maybe ask permission, to maybe give them some heads up whenever certain things happen, and to certainly treat them as a person, first and foremost. If they're saying no, then we pause and we pull back and we have a conversation. Right? We keep them covered. It's like when you get a massage. They don't just rip the sheets off of you. Well, some massage parlors do. And you're like, oh my gosh, that was abrupt, right? But there's a way of wrapping a person in order to have some reverence for their body and to honor this privilege of being able to touch them. But we don't really even do that in medicine. So I think this is probably not what you expected me to say, but I do think that remembering that the reason that this couple is here in front of you is because they were willing to unite in a very vulnerable space, and for you to not have some reverence for what brought them here in the first place, I actually think is a part of the dehumanization of our birthing families. So one thing I will say about this is that contrasting the hospital environment to the home environment, the first time I ever went to a home birth, I went home to my wife and I said, like, I don't know what it is about home birth, but like, I just want to go and have sex with you. It sounds like a strange thing to have happen, but it was almost like a remembering of just how carnal this expression is, this birthing thing is. This isn't a medical procedure. This was an expression of two people's like divine union, and a baby emerged. Like, it like helps you remember when you can have reverence for what we're even here to do. There's a person here giving birth. Like, doesn't that feel powerful? Like, I went and talked to my wife, and it was overnight that we were at this birth, and she and I went out to brunch, and I was like, honey, I'm just like feeling inspired again. Like it feels like a human thing that I did, not like a surgical thing that I did. It felt like I was a part of something very awesome, awe-inspiring. And it doesn't always feel like that in the hospital.
When you talk about healthcare providers, you say they should model healthcare versus sick care.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit about what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, I think despite physicians for now nearly a century, I mean, probably longer than that, I think physicians have sort of felt that They have the ultimate toolkit for keeping people healthy. While I think that that is true, if you get hit by a car or you're working on the table saw and you chop your finger off,
Nothing else is going to help.
not going to go to the homeopathist or the chiropractor for that. I think we got to get that sutured back on, and bloodborne infections, certain things that happen in pregnancy definitely calls for hospitals and doctors. So let's just start by saying that. However, the majority of things that are the most expensive and the most morbid, and when I say morbid, I mean sort of detracting from quality of life, things like diabetes, heart disease, COPD, obesity, the metabolic syndrome complex. I think most of those issues are not being addressed well for a lot of reasons. But even if our healthcare system and our doctors were not trained to be pharmaceutical technicians, but rather having a full, comprehensive notion as to how to eat well and move well and all of that, we still have hospitals themselves that are not really reflective of how to live and eat well. So if you go to any hospital and you go to their cafeteria.
Oh, I was just thinking about the trays that come, terrible.
Yeah, I mean the trays that that get to deliver to the bedside. It's like your diabetic meal will be like low sugar syrup with pancakes, and it's like the whole thing is like, why are we serving pancakes anyways, let alone a diabetic version or whatever?
Terrible. When I gave birth, I knew I didn't want to eat any of that. My mom made me these like incredible stuffed birds that I ate.
Oh my gosh.
And those were like, I was
like stuffed birds, like little pheasants?
It's like a delicacy. It's an Egyptian delicacy where you stuff these birds, and she got me like 2 of them like that big after I delivered my twin girls.
That sounds amazing.
It was amazing. And she literally, I hadn't eaten in like who knows how long, and I ate them up.
Yeah.
And I was like, do you have more? And she's like, no, I just, that's all I brought.
It's a freaking delicacy. They're like $1,000 a piece, Mira.
I'm just like, give me more. Yeah, but
Yeah.
But yeah, the food.
The food is
hospitals.
Yeah, I mean, that alone is such a problem. And so even working in hospitals, a big part of the reason I've left is not just because of a philosophical tension. It was like, I can't live in hospitals. This is unhealthy. There's right angles everywhere. There's nothing natural about the space.
The lighting.
The lighting. There's like an EMF like pulse throughout the whole building because they need lots of power for a variety of reasons. And then the cafeteria and the water's crap. The cafeteria food is laden with seed oils and sugar. And while that might be what the consumer wants, you are a freaking hospital. So it looks almost like a 7-Eleven when you go in there. I mean, there's like pastries with all this junk in it. And while I, like anybody, loves a donut once in a while, and I don't restrict myself completely from eating those foods, if you are sick and in a hospital, or if you are a healthcare worker who's living in a hospital basically 3 or 4 days, that's all that you're eating. And so as a consequence, we have a healthcare workforce that is extremely unwell. So the last I checked, Mira, it was something like 25 to 30% of physicians in the United States are either pre-diabetic or diabetic. Most doctors they're overweight in the very least. Many are obese. Many of them are taking multiple pharmaceuticals. And so it's no surprise that so many of them are so willing and compelled to prescribe pharmaceuticals for you, as opposed to saying, hey, listen, let's do this diabetes medication or Ozempic or one of these new semaglutides to lose weight. Let's do this for a period of time, but ultimately we need to get your health in order. Because nobody's ever said, we need you to be healthy in order to take care of people. And it's just like when you're on the airplane. The oxygen mask, you have to put it on before you help somebody else. These are people that are not only exposed to so much junk food and all that other stuff, but they're also being told you're not supposed to sleep, you're not supposed to laugh or play or do anything. You're supposed to work. You are a worker bee, and we're going to pay you decently well, not a ton of money, but decently well. And we're going to give you all this med school debt where you really don't have any other way of stepping out and doing something else. So you're compelled to do this job. You're not being incentivized to sleep, which is the number 1 medicine I recommend to anybody. Number 2 would be sourcing out the best quality food, especially the most nutritious, like beef liver from your local regenerative farm. People scoff at that idea, but like the reason that the United States is just so falling so far behind is, you know, if there's an apocalypse and aliens came down in 1,000 years, they would see a Chipotle, a 7-Eleven, and a Costco. A Chipotle, a 7-Eleven, and a Costco. Throw in some churches there, right? And that's what we have to show, as opposed to farmland where cows and plants and flowers and everything is as an ecosystem, biodynamically regenerating itself. And we are a part of that. We've separated ourselves so far in this war against nature that we have forgotten that that stuff in the cafeteria is not even classifiable as food.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, it's a sticking point, and a lot of people would say, but not everybody can afford that. I'm not saying everybody can afford it. I'm saying even our top 1% is not doing their best to take care of themselves.
Yeah, but honestly, like this is, if there's a minimum of education around food, beans, lentils, that's not expensive food.
Right.
That is very nourishing food.
Right.
So it's a matter of educating people
Right.
on how to eat, you
Right.
know?
Right.
Like you don't need to have a lot of money to eat well. You
No.
just need to know what to eat.
Yeah, and actually some of the most nutritious foods is actually way cheaper than the fancy stuff that you think is what the rich, elite, healthy people are
Yeah.
you know, consuming, and that is the only way to do it. We don't have a ton of money, my wife and I, but we do prioritize our resources towards having the healthiest water, the healthiest, you know, air inside of our home, you know, the healthiest stuff that's going on our skin, like beauty supplies and whatnot. And that doesn't mean that we're breaking the bank for that. It does mean that we are going out of our way to try to find the healthiest seafood that we can afford and whatnot. And if you're on this pregnancy journey, like your kids, through epigenetics and a variety of other factors, are going to, their long-term health is going to start the moment that they're conceived. So it's really, I just think it's so important that we as doctors are modeling what we're trying to talk to our clients about. And if we can't prioritize those things, then we can't expect a lot of families in the United States that don't have a lot of money or free time to do it either.
Yeah, of course. So you run this platform called the Born Free Method. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so back during COVID, which I don't think is very forgettable for anybody, I was getting inundated with questions and requests for people to show up at their births, because a lot of people were not feeling all that compelled to be in the hospital, or they couldn't find a midwife who would allow them. Permission slips are not required for you to birth however you want. But a lot of people were being told you can't do that here or in this way.
Because of different state regulations.
Yeah, or like the masking procedures and the swabbing and the vaccines and all of that. So Sarah and I, Sarah's my best friend, she trained on the farm in Tennessee, and she's recently resigned, but she was such a radical she was so radical in her approach to life, and even as these topics were surfacing during COVID, that I was like, man, we really are like cut from the same cloth, you know, as birth workers. Like we both were doing the work, but we both also realized during that time that we're getting a lot of the same questions. And if we could just write a book, the book, you know, it's like what Toni Morrison says. If there's a book out there that you've been wanting to read, but it hasn't yet been written, then you have to write it. And that's kind of what we came to. Let's write a book, but then it turned into an online course. And the whole purpose here of the Born Free community is that it's not enough to just have the course or the book or the videos or the, you know, reading list. It actually, what is required is for you to be taken through a lot of the themes that we've talked about. What does radical accountability mean? Do you want real freedom? Because if so, you have to own whatever the outcomes are. If you get the vaccine and there's an injury, that's also a part of your decision. If you don't get the vaccine and your kid gets sick, that's a part of the decision. So how can we impress upon people that they have so much more power than they've ever imagined when they just start saying, you know, I'm going to do it my way. And that's how Sarah and I live our lives. So we start there. And then, of course, we get into the risks, benefits, alternatives to literally everything under the sun. We talk about how to write a birth plan, how to choose a provider. We're in a unique position to do this because we're not just epidemiologists. We're actually experienced birth workers who've attended thousands of births. And there's some people out there that have courses that they've attended 300 births. That's great. We've gone to thousands. And so when we say we're not worried about this, we mean it. It's not just magical thinking. Sometimes emergencies arise, and hopefully you have somebody there that can also help you with that if you've chosen to have a birth worker. So it is the most complete preconception, meaning all the fertility workup, all the way through postpartum and newborn care program on the planet. We worked on it for about 9 months. It's like a 9-month gestational period. And we continue to add to it, but it's more than just the pre-recorded content. It's also weekly calls, weekly coaching calls. People get direct access to me. They get my cell phone number. So when something comes up, even in labor, you just call me. And we put all of that together into a program, including a resource list and citations and links to other programs that can do things that we don't, fully do, like, birth fit for fitness in the postpartum period, for example. We do all of that, and we also impress upon people the importance of lifestyle modification, which is not being talked enough about in any regard. And I think partly because I don't think a lot of people know that stuff, but Sarah and I are both pretty darn enthusiastic about having the best food, the best water, movement, stress mitigation, stretching, mobility, sleep, all of that stuff, and helping people appreciate that all of the stuff that people are trying to scare you about, whether it's having a C-section, it's induction, it's small babies, it's big babies, it's whatever, that almost all of that can be prevented if you can put your resources and your time and willingness towards growing the healthiest baby and having the best birth possible, even if you have no resources. It's not rocket science. But when we put all of that together, including having a private forum for people to ask questions without censorship or judgment, it has created a space where people are having their dream births, and they're also getting support for dads, as I mentioned, and they can really appreciate what the duo of a midwife and an OB can really bring to their care. And interestingly, so many people have decided, once they've started the program, that they almost don't even have any questions. Like, they've become so re-inspired to just remember their innate power in this process. You guys made this baby. You can have this baby and you're going to be great parents. But we need to stop always asking for permission to be who we know we are and for listening to our intuition. In fact, in my opinion, your intuition is authoritative knowledge. And if you can remember that, and we practice that, let's start practicing that as soon as you get a glimmer in your eye that you want to have children, it becomes very, very easy to just have a baby later. And of course, if your pregnancy plan changes and your birth plan changes from home to the hospital, we've got you there too. So we're having a lot of fun with it, and it's been it's almost a year that since we launched it. So,
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So one of my big things with Into Healing is wanting to make healing more accessible to people and not having healing always be something that people have to pay for, especially people who really don't have the means or can't afford it. Do you do scholarships with people? How do you make it more accessible so everybody can be part of a program like that?
I don't remember the last time that I turned somebody down, but what I'll also say is some people, I think, appreciate just how frivolous sometimes we are in what we spend our money on. I mean, even your health insurance premiums, that ultimately leads to a much reduced rate of a C-section, right? If we were to consider how we spend our resources and where we put our energy, that you kind of get what you pay for. Keeping that in mind, we've had people who have sold stock. They've sold their rental property because they want to be in the program. And I can't remember the last time I said no to somebody for finances. Even my own practice, which is Beloved Holistics, I do all my consults on a donation basis, which I think is actually far more equitable than hey, you still get 45 minutes for a lesser fee based on your tax returns or something. It's more like, listen, if you need my support, I'm not going to turn you down. And I have limited time, and I have to also have boundaries of my own. So people can make a donation, and I'll give you as much time as I have. And we really treat Born Free like that as well. I don't want anybody to ever feel like this is absolutely something I need, and if only I could afford it. That's just not in my constitution.
Beautiful. Thank you. So my last question for you is, when people ask you what you do, you always start by saying, I keep people safe through rites of passage. And I feel when you say that, you mentioned it earlier, you talk about birth and death and how death is part of what you do as well. I'd love to hear more about how death is part of what you do.
Remember the movie The Green Knight? It's kind of an indie film, but the whole story is around rites of passage. It's around the hero's journey. And the reason, for those who haven't seen it, go and see that movie, because it really sort of describes this notion that you can live and have all the riches and fame, but if you're not really living in a way that's in alignment with your heart, which sometimes requires you to die and be reborn. That's almost like the epitome of the hero's journey. Like, you have to be willing to lose everything in order to really emerge as your fully embodied self. Sometimes that has to happen at some point in your life for you to ever actually fully realize yourself, your unique self, going back to Mark Gaffney's language. And this story, this hero's journey piece, is something that has always kind of pervaded my work, because we have birth and we have death. And the reason I think I've been so compelled by them is that people will say, oh, you're a beginning and end doctor, you're a bookend doctor. But I really want people to consider, like, what comes first? And if we don't really know what comes after death, we know from like near-death experiences and whatnot that there's something that happens there. And we, of course, know what happens in birth, sort of. But there's still this ineffability around the importance of this rite of passage. I like to juxtapose these two events for people, number one, to not take life so seriously, but number two, also realize that just because something is scary doesn't mean that it actually isn't not only necessary, but also highly desirable. In other words, there may be a privilege to you dying at the end, as opposed to something that we should be using our money and our medicines to avoid. Anti-aging, longevity medicine, let's just go to the moon, fuck Earth, you know? Instead of investing so much on that path, what if we just paused and relished in the notion that in order to live, we have to die? There is no life without death. And I guess the reason that I'm so compelled by these two specialties is I don't know if I ever would have appreciated the magic of childbirth had I not sat with so much death. And seeing how some people are so content with this. How could you be so content with dying? Because our young ego, like our egoic false self, whatever you want to call it, sees that as the ultimate loss. And many of us are still stuck there. But once you sit with it so many times and you're like, oh, that person actually gets it. There's something more there. And maybe you take a bunch of mushrooms out in the woods, or maybe you do something else that helps you clarify that there's more to this than what you've held on to for your whole life, materially or otherwise. Sitting with death has helped me appreciate that I don't know what happens before or after either of these things. In some way, that gives me a sense of relief. And perhaps if I can embrace the privilege of dying, similar to the hero's journey, perhaps that's actually the only way for me to be fully embodied with my own sort of unique self and how I fit into the cosmos. So I should be running towards that and not away. And you could say the same, just replace the words death and birth. You could say the same about birth.
Back in Lebanon, there's this saying in Arabic. I'm trying to translate it in my head. It's like, basically, we come from the universe, God, Mama Earth, whatever you want to call it, the source, right? And we go back to source, and that's how it is. So there's an acceptance of that.
Yeah.
That like we come from the source and we go back to the source, and that's how, and it just keeps cycling over and over again. But I think there's a resistance to that in this like modern, day world. We want to resist. We want to resist death. We want to resist so much, right? We don't want to surrender to anything. We want to fight it all.
Well, I actually think that is a reflection of our unwillingness to be our true selves. And it's not hey, your ego doesn't matter, and it's not just one love. It's actually this sort of unique expression of God living through you. Like, only Mira can be Mira. Everybody else is taken anyways. I can't remember what poet wrote that, but Mira living out her most unique expression of herself is actually a part of the game. And so in order for you to live out your entire personal existence, you also have to die. But that doesn't mean you are dying. In fact, probably in the past week, you did die. Your physical body has completely regenerated. That means that there's something more than just you. That's something I was waxing with one of my recent home birth clients. His name's Jason. And he's like, you can't die. You've already died. And it just was like this little epiphany. So I think that our inability to reconcile that there is a true, unique expression of Nathan Riley And in order to be that person, I have to actually let go of a little bit of this ego. That is so scary. But what would happen if I actually did fully embrace that? Like, it's so scary to us to actually just be us, authentically, fully ourselves. Because if we are, then that death thing sounds like catastrophic. Like, I got to hold on to this. I can't let go of that and become me. And your unique self is not all this. It's something completely unique in and of itself. Thank you for giving me some of your time.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
It's been a real joy to be here with you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. You can connect with Into Healing on TikTok and Instagram for more inspirational and behind-the-scenes content, and visit our website, intohealing.com, for transcripts and other goodies. Thank you for joining us.